Good morning, everyone, and apologize about being a little bit late getting this availability started. It's obviously a very busy and key week here for the Congress and for President Biden. Let me start with the state of play around the so-called reconciliation bill, because once again we are looking at a deadline that comes this Sunday, October 31st, when the highway transportation bill, basically extension, expires, the funding for the highway trust fund. So there is a real deadline, one that we need to meet, and I continue to implore all of my colleagues, because this part of the bill is bipartisan, to go ahead and pass the once in 50-year bipartisan infrastructure bill that not only makes record investments in roads and bridges and rail, but makes unprecedented investments in areas like broadband, $65 billion. We ought to make sure that every home in Virginia has access to high-speed, affordable broadband. These dollars, built upon the very progressive things that Governor Northam has already done, would make that happen. In this bill as well, we got, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $48 billion on resiliency. You talk about an issue that's particularly important in Hampton Roads with the level of flooding and storms that we've seen, or for that matter, flooding up in my hometown of Alexandria that happens on a regular basis. These federal dollars on resiliency are extraordinarily important. And one thing that sometimes gets glossed over in the infrastructure bill is there's $85 billion on movements towards greener energy, investments in a smarter grid, investments in capping abandoned wells, investments in making sure we move towards more electric vehicles in terms of charging stations or electric buses that, again, hope we could make in Virginia. So we need to get that passed as soon as possible. Now, obviously, because of all the sausage making, that's tied up with the second half of the president's agenda, which, again, I think we're very close to closing out a deal on. And while most of the debate has been about, the top line number, the revenue components, and we'll come back to some of those, I'm sure, in the questions, one of the things that I think we need to focus on is we're all concerned about inflation. A lot of the inflation that is being seen out there is due to challenges in the supply chain. Part of the challenges in the supply chain are about getting people back to work. If you just look at the numbers, there's about 4 million Americans that have not been able to get back to work because of concerns about child care or taking care of their sick and ailing parents. There's another 3 million plus that are afraid of going back to work because of threats around COVID. Frankly, around COVID, let's get vaccinated and move past that, around the questions of getting people back to work so we could get rid of the challenges in the supply chain. A key part of the president's plan is investments in child care, in universal pre-K, and making sure that we have those caregivers who will take care of our parents and the disabled, that becomes a reality. So you want to grapple with those supply chain issues, let's pass the second half of the president's bill. And again, I think we are very, very close. The sausage making has been pretty ugly, but I think we are close. And one of the ramifications, one last issue before we go to questions, and that is the need to get the infrastructure bill, the funding for roads, bridges, broadband, but also for transit is extraordinarily important. We're seeing those problems play out now real time here in Northern Virginia with the WMATA systems, with the Metro. I, like everybody, is concerned with the level of delays that have taken place due to the fact that Metro has taken out the so-called Kawasaki 7,000 cars from the system. That has caused extraordinary delays in people returning to Metro in a way to get back to work and go about their daily lives. Tim Kaine and I and others in the delegation have written the leadership of Metro and said, you got to get this fixed, but the paramount issue as you get service back online is got to be safety. What happened with the Kawasaki 7000 series cars? I think we're going to have to wait till the end of the NTSB investigation. The Metro leadership itself can't comment while that's under investigation. We want NTSB to finish that investigation as quickly as possible. We've got to maintain safety. And in the interim, we are pushing the Metro leadership to get some of the earlier cars that have been taken offline, as long as they are safe, to have them refurbished and put back into service so we can start diminishing these delays. The challenge, and seems like sometimes Metro can't catch a break, is that we were starting to see those numbers click up in terms of usage of Metro increase, which we've got to have happen for the long-term viability. Having these delays, which then pushes ridership back down, is a problem that Metro didn't need at this point. But we are staying on, and I'm in regular contact with the Metro leadership to keep pushing them, but we've got to make sure safety first. So with that, and apologies for being a little bit late, Val, let's go to the questions.
Our first question is going to be from Mitchell Miller from WTOP.
Good morning, Senator. Thanks for joining us. On the bipartisan infrastructure bill, how concerned and how disappointed would you be if there is no vote on that bill this week due to the sausage making? And then secondly, since you have been involved so deeply with the revenue-raising side of things, which of the tax proposals, perhaps the minimum corporate tax, do you think will actually raise the most money toward whatever it turns out to be, somewhere south of $2 trillion?
Well, great questions, Mitchell. Let me first of all start with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. First time in 50 years, a bill of this size and scope with 69 votes in the Senate. Gosh, I scratch my head about why can't we give the president a win, the people of Virginia a win, the country a win, and get that bill to the president's desk. I would like to have it this week. I think it would clearly help my friend Terry McAuliffe show our ability to govern. I do think Terry's going to be okay regardless of that, because he has recognized we've got to do more to get Democrats, independents, and those who fear a return of Trumpism to the polls. And I think those early vote numbers have clicked up in his favor. So needed, but Terry's going to win regardless. But I think, again, if we don't get it done, it is a huge missed opportunity. Also for the president to show a real win to the international leaders that he'll be starting to meet with after Thursday. On the question of the revenue raisers, I think it's a fair question. I frankly wish we would go ahead and get rid of some of the Trump tax cuts. Let's go ahead and raise corporate rates to 25, raise capital gains to 28. Folks like me who've done very well, take the top rates back to 39. I've gotten virtually no pushback on those reasonable adjustments. Matter of fact, I think they had been baked in to people and the market's expectations. That may not come to be the final product, because in a 50-50 Senate, everybody can be king or queen for a day, and some members are exercising that right. But let me go ahead and tell you where I think some of the big revenue raisers are that make sense. One that nobody's focused on is closing the loophole around the so-called NIT tax, or the 3.8% increase for high earners that was put in place after Obamacare. I didn't fully realize, as much of a nerd as I am, that closing that loophole and making sure everybody pays what's in the law would actually raise almost $250 billion. I think a lot of agreement on there, very little pushback. I think as well, the idea of a small, about 1% tax on stock buybacks to equalize the tax treatment with dividends, again, north of $100 billion there, I think that makes enormous sense. I think the idea of aligning a minimum corporate tax with the rest of the world, one of the things the president's going to be working on this trip is this effort to try to bring up a 15% minimum tax around the industrial world. It's not just Americans who are losing out, but other countries that have fair tax regimes. When countries put their intellectual property in a low tax place, like the Bahamas or like Ireland, all industrial countries kind of lose out. Stabilizing that rate at a fair rate around 15% raises hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think that makes some sense. I've been working on an area that is international taxation, the so-called GILTI and FDII rates. Nobody here wants me to go into the details on those, but there is, and the House did this as well, there is an adjustment to move that up into that 15% range. And because of the complexities of not raising the corporate rate, that actually raises more money than we anticipated. On the very highest level revenue raisers, the so-called billionaires tax, listen, I don't think it's fair that people who have tens of billions of dollars, particularly with appreciated stock, don't pay anything on that appreciation. The devil, though, on how you get it right is in the details. And Senator Wyden, who's proposed this so-called billionaires tax, I'm going to review it. We just got the details this morning. Getting those details right are terribly important. But there are areas that I think are fair that could get at that issue of those wealthiest of wealthy, making sure they kick in a fair amount. For example, I think that people ought to be able to pass on their wealth without an undue event happening at death. I think they ought to pay an estate tax, but there's something called the so-called step-up in basis. I would still give that benefit to folks, but I would make the change in what's called carryover basis. Again, I can imagine people's eyes already glazing over. The end result of this is, you ought to be able to not pay the tax at death, but if your heirs go ahead and sell that asset 2 years after the original maker of the revenue has passed away, they shouldn't be able to get it virtually tax-free. I could get into the details. The other component, one of the things that I found a lot of agreement on is, very, very wealthy people, one of the ways they avoid paying any tax is borrowing against their oftentimes billions of dollars of stock that they hold. That borrowing against isn't viewed as a taxable event. Well, if that's the way they finance their lifestyle, I view that as closing a tax loophole. And even the business groups I've talked to think that would be a fair way to get at some of those folks, literally who are in that multi-billionaire classification. I think there are smart ways to get at all this, Mitchell. The challenge here is the pressure to get a deal, which I feel very strongly, and the very necessary approach that says getting tax policy right requires some time. And I hope we can get both. Let's go ahead and show the framework, get the infrastructure deal to the president, and then let us, in terms of writing the technical details of these revenue raisers, spend the time to let these ideas get fully vetted and make sure we get the details right.
Thank you very much.
Our next question is going to be from Michael Martz from the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Senator. I'm interested in what you think of the issue of combating climate change within the reconciliation bill. The president's remarks in Arlington last night, he got heckled by a group of protesters who about an oil pipeline, but they also sprinkled in references to Senator Manchin's opposition and feeling that he's caved to that. What do you think about Senator Manchin's demands on that, and how do you strike the balance on taking action on climate change to support the president at the conference, the global conference, and still protecting the fossil fuel industry?
Well, Michael, a lot there, and let me try to take it somewhat sequentially. First of all, climate change is real, and it is a threat to our country. It is a threat to our economy. It is a threat to, frankly, everybody on the planet. And I think there may be only a few, reluctant elected officials who don't acknowledge that. When you got a third of the country this summer that couldn't go outside because of forest fires, when you got close to another third under the threat of flooding from weather events, when you've got the balance of folks, when more people die in their basements in New York City than in a hurricane in Louisiana because of unusual weather events, this is real and it is now. And I think we ought to be all in. Solving the challenge of climate change is both about the existential threat, but it's also about job creation. It's also about national security. I had a classified brief yesterday about all the areas where China, and yes, China's not making a change fast enough because they're still putting some coal plants online, but area after area in clean energy, from batteries to wind turbines. And I applaud what the governor has done and others have done in terms of Virginia's leadership in wind energy, the solar panels. China is dominating each of these areas, both for their domestic consumption, but also they see where the puck is headed in terms of the growth of clean energy business lines, and they're making those investments. And it's crazy for America not to do it. So my wish list would have included not only these tax incentives that are in the bill, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but also I think we needed to go ahead and put a price on carbon. One of the best things we could do for American manufacturing is to go ahead and put a carbon price in place, because actually American manufacturing, we have cleaned up our act more than countries like China and India. And those American manufacturers are competing with products that are coming in, being made in very dirty manners. And that puts American manufacturing, because it costs a little more to do it cleaner in America, at an enormous disadvantage. The only way we can charge in the global framework of trade and tariff those other countries for their dirty manufacturing process if we put a carbon price in place so you can have a border adjustment tax. Not having that, and I'm working on folks like Senator Manchin to see if we can get that done. It probably won't be done in the next couple of days, but that's where we've got to head. In the interim, the report, at least, that there will be over $500 billion of market-based tax incentives around climate in the final reconciliation bill, I think is a dramatic step forward. And if we can get that deal and give that ammunition to the president as he meets with the balance of the world leadership, that strengthens his hand to force those reluctant nations to move forward. And I would put one last point here that I think sometimes gets lost in a lot of this discussion. Even though certain countries in Europe have taken more aggressive stances in some of their laws, who's made the most actual progress on carbon reduction has honestly, at least over the short term, been the United States. Not because we've not been aggressive enough, and I think we should be more aggressive, but because we have used interim fuels like natural gas. And you've got literally cases in a country like Germany, because they've taken nuclear off the field and because of the inability to have sustained power generation, where they're putting coal plants back online, and that is not good for Germany. It's not good for the climate long term. This is an extraordinarily complicated area. We need to have American leadership, both from around greener energy sources, just from kind of who's going to make them, as well as where they're going to be sold. Also, I think we ultimately need a price on carbon. In the interim, giving the president the $500 billion of tax incentives for businesses and consumers to make these changes, I think is the right kind of package that he needs to bring to Glasgow. Sorry for the long answer there, but it's an important question, Michael.
Our next question is going to be from Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. Last time you had mentioned that you had voted early for this election. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the changes made to absentee voting over the past couple of years, why you chose to participate in early voting this year, and if it's a voting process that you would recommend to other Virginians.
Well, Amy, I know I'm showing my age here, but I remember when it was hugely bipartisan for everybody to say, you know what, in a democracy, our democracy actually works better if more people vote. I'm old enough to remember when there was broad-based Republican support for things like motor voter, the idea that you could easily register to vote when you get your driver's license. The fact that this issue is no longer bipartisan, a lot of that falls at the feet of Donald Trump, the loser who still can't accept that, and in an effort to excuse his loss has tried to basically imply and undermine the integrity of our voting system. And the fact that there are candidates for state office in Virginia that say election integrity is one of the top issues of the time is stunning to me. And I think, undemocratic, little d, as anything I've seen. So I absolutely applaud the notion that we ought to make it easier, that we ought to have early voting, that we ought to be able to do no excuse absentee, that we can actually have people vote on the weekends when working people who can't get off on election day can't vote. So maybe you can go on a weekend beforehand. I think that makes sense. And I think the integrity of our election system, I know a lot of voter registrars around Virginia, Democrat and Republican alike, who take great pride in the process we have in Virginia, in its validity. I think it is outrageous the number of election poll workers that are now being threatened by Trumpites and others who support Trump to do their civic duty. The idea that folks that used to belong to the League of Women Voters, who would be the nonpartisan checkers, are now getting threatened. I mean, this is Virginia. This is America. And the outrage of these election deniers, the advocates of the big lie. You don't need to take my word for it about the validity of our elections. Chris Krebs, who was the cyber expert who worked for Donald Trump, who did a great job working in a voluntary way to get every state's election system cleaner and safer from outside interference. He made the honest statement that the elections in 2020 were clean and honest. Now, it cost him his job. Trump immediately fired him. But for folks that play into that big lie, I don't know how they can anyway call themselves defenders of our Constitution and of our democracy.
Our next question is from Gene Marino from WFIR.
Yes, Senator, thanks for taking my call. I just sort of along the same lines, but what does it portend, and you know something about the position, what does it portend in Virginia, Governor, Senator, if Terry McAuliffe does not win the election, does it hold any special meaning for Democrats, maybe even at the congressional level next year, if the Democrats don't hold that seat in Virginia?
Listen, political prognostication, I'm going to leave to you guys. But I think, the rest of the nation is looking at Virginia. We're looking at New Jersey. I think I hope Virginia is going to continue to lead the nation. I know back when I ran for governor and Tim Kaine ran for lieutenant governor back in 2001, and we were successful. It changed the tenor of Virginia politics. We then had to govern, and Virginia did get named, best managed state, best state for business, best state to receive a public education. That ability to govern helped Virginia Democrats, I think, for decades to come. But I am much more optimistic today than I was 10 days ago that Terry's going to be successful. I see the early vote numbers ticking up. I think you sometimes see these things for your own personal views. I remember back in 2014, I was ahead, but the electorate wasn't riled up, and I kind of only got really focused on that the last 2.5 weeks. Terry and his campaign, to their credit, I think realized in an off-year election, you need to rally the troops a little bit earlier. They kind of sounded the alarm about 5 weeks ago, and I think that get out the vote effort that they've mounted now is for a gubernatorial race unprecedented.
Our next question is from Alex Lamone from Nexstar.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for doing this. I wanted to ask you about the reporting that Democrats are once again again, talking about including some sort of immigration measure in the reconciliation package. I wanted to ask you if you could discuss, what is on the table potentially and what the plan would be to get a thumbs up from the Senate parliamentarians to get that in the bill.
Over the years as a elected official, I'm pretty willing to opine on almost everything. But one thing, even though I'm 12 years into my tenure as the Senate, that I just stink at is fully understanding or appreciating all the arcane notions of the Senate rules and procedures. So I don't have the foggiest idea what the parliamentarian is going to rule. What I do know is that the parliamentarian, I have great respect for her. I think she calls them as she sees them. And I don't see a viable option to overrule her. I may not like her balls and strikes calls, but I think she does the right job. On the substance, boy, I hope there is an ability to get some components of immigration into this bill. I think it is wrong, unfair, and frankly unjust that dreamers, for example, young people who've been brought here, who've, as minor children, who've lived only in this country. 96% of these people are either in school, at work, or in the military, who have enormous contributions to our nation, that their legal status is in jeopardy because inability to have a dreamer's piece of legislation put through. I think those recipients of what's called TPS, Temporary Protective Services, we in the greater Washington area have a huge Salvadorian community. Many of these folks came here in the early 90s as an outgrowth of the Salvadoran Civil War. They have known, again, nothing but our country. They have made enormous contributions to our community. The number of Salvadoran businesses, they're some of the most prosperous entrepreneurial immigrants that we have. There are a series of other countries that folks are here through TPS. The fact that they are constantly in limbo just is not fair. The idea that we ought to have a path to some level of legal status for other undocumented folks, if they pay their taxes, learn English, go through the kind of hoops that were put forward in legislation that was bipartisan 8 or 9 years ago, makes enormous sense. So I'm all in on immigration reform. I wish we could do it through what's so-called regular order, that there'd be at least 10 Republicans that would, do more than pay lip service to this. If we can do it through reconciliation, I'm for that. But again, we've got to look to the Senate rules and the parliamentarian who will make that ultimate judge around what's so-called Byrd rule. And I won't even get into the details on that. But that's the way the process was set up. I would simply say is, if you're going to use an extraordinary measure, the originator of this rule, Senator Byrd from West Virginia, said it's got to be somewhat difficult, and boy, oh boy, we're finding it is difficult to get through those hoops.
And we are running short on
would
time.
I be able to just clarify?
Oh, we're going to move on because we're running short on time. So this is going to be the last question from Ian Stewart with VPN.
Thanks, Senator Warner. A few weeks ago, this is also around voting. A few weeks ago, you looked into issues around the management of local post offices with delivery, and you visited one in Charlottesville. Do you have any updates on the progress since there's an upcoming election and mail-in ballots might be at issue?
Well, I'm going back to Charlottesville next week. I've also seen problems around Richmond and other areas around the state. I'm still concerned about the management at the post office from the very top levels on down. I think some of the reforms that this management, Postmaster DeJoy in particular, put in place were ill-timed, not thought through, and clearly there was a lot of pushback from the workforce. I also think that one of the fundamental problems we've got with the post office is it's a different post office today in terms of the competitive landscape than it was 30 years ago. You, in a sense, have a lot of the delivery companies who use the post office for that last mile or 5 miles, where they take the more profitable routes that are urban to urban. And we've got to recognize that. We also, at the end of the day, and one of the problems we had in Charlottesville is we got to get more folks into that post office. The number of Americans who are willing or look at the post office as a long-term stable career where you can take that leap into the middle class, unfortunately has changed. And we need to make that postal office job more attractive. Part of that is around pay. Once you do get in, there are great benefits. But I've been very disappointed in Charlottesville and elsewhere where the local management even has not been nearly aggressive enough on job fairs and going out and trying to hire folks to get more postal carriers. We had a short-term surge where they brought in about 15 extra, actually it was greater than that, mail deliverers, post people, that are post office folks, postmen in old parlance, to help surge. That is a short-term solution, not a long-term solution. I'm going to be back next week and expecting to hear what the longer term solutions are. I need to hear that at both the local level and at the national level. And the commitment I make to Virginians is everything I can do in my power. And if even it comes to repeated visits to keep the pressure on, we're going to do that, because people, the post office even predates the Constitution. And if people are talking about timely delivery of absentee ballots or making sure your bills get paid on time or you receive medicines in a timely manner, this is an issue of absolute life and death in certain cases in terms of medicines. Thank you so much, everybody. Again, I'm sorry we didn't get to as many questions and that I was a little bit late, but rest assured, to quote former Governor Schwarzenegger, I'll be back.